So now that we understand what growth is and how a constant exponential growth rate can be attained, so under constant conditions, and when growth stops, when nutrients are, one or more nutrients are depleting, the next question is to understand, the next problem that we need to understand is, if cells grow, then molecules are continuously being converted into these macromolecular building blocks of cells, and cells are being made as fixed proportions of these macromolecular building blocks. But underlying that, so underlying metabolism, we have biochemical processes. Right? And typically we call those processes reactions. So molecules do things. They have behaviors like conversion, movement, complex formation, destroying other molecules. And these individual processes are called reactions. They form a network of molecular interactions. Right? But essentially this is a biochemical reaction network, because each molecular event can be viewed as a reaction. And that network of molecular interaction underlies metabolism, but also signal transduction, signaling, and gene expression. But so far we've looked at metabolism. So now the next thing to consider is these biochemical processes, these biochemical reactions. How does that work? Okay, so we need to get a basal understanding of them before we can continue to the mathematical description. Okay, so let's consider a bacterium with proteins in it. And small molecules like glucose, acetate, pyruvate, intermediates of metabolism, right? They're all there, and some of these things are interconverted, protein complexes are made, etc. Okay, so the entire network is doing its thing. And now we would like to identify some key aspects. So one key aspect is diffusion. And another aspect, of course, is binding or association. Another key aspect is dissociation. Right, and a fourth aspect is conversion. So it's these four key aspects of biochemical reactions that we want to understand, and we want to describe those mathematically. So we want to have a mathematical description of these processes. So in other words, we want to quantify these processes. And why do we want to quantify them? Well, otherwise we cannot do experiments. Otherwise we cannot interpret experiments. So for an experimental interpretation, we need standard concepts for biochemical processes. And since these processes are quantitative, so one process is a little bit faster than the other one, it's about exact concentration, it's about exact rates of reactions. We cannot do this quantitatively, we cannot do this qualitatively just by saying faster or slower, but we really want to associate numbers to the activities of these processes, so we need to quantify them. And the only way to do quantification in terms of science is with mathematical descriptions. There is no other way. Okay? So we need to describe these fundamental biochemical processes that underlie network behavior, that underlies metabolism, signal, gene expression, and life. We need to describe those mathematically. So, in the next chapter we're mostly going to look at binding, dissociation, and conversion. But in this chapter we're going to look at diffusion. So let's look at diffusion. And I guess that is the last part of chapter 2. We just confirm whether that's correct. So let's see if there's anything else. There's also a little bit of kinetics in this chapter still. Let's see. Alright. There's also a little bit of kinetics. So that means that the binding, so the association, dissociation, and conversion is also still part of this lecture. Alright, so diffusion. Molecules move spontaneously. Okay, so apparently they do that. They stop moving at 0 Kelvin temperature. So at 0 Kelvin there is no movement. Okay, and that is because the energy for molecule movement depends on temperature. Okay. So let's call the energy for movement E move. Alright. And the energy for movement turns out, this is a constant times T. And that's the Boltzmann constant. You can look that up. And the temperature you can measure with a thermometer. So we know the energy available for movement. Now, let's say I have a cell, and there is water molecules everywhere. And we have proteins, and we have a big protein versus small proteins. Now, the big protein is going to move slower, okay? And the reason is that it experiences more friction with the water molecules that move erratically. So all these water molecules, they move in random positions themselves, and they bump into this big molecule all the time. And the big molecule can only move if there are more water molecules, say, on the left than on the right. Okay? And that probability is lower when it's bigger, because then there are more molecules of water in total. So the probability is that you have less molecules to the right and to the left is smaller. If you have a smaller molecule, you have less water molecules surrounding the protein molecule in this case. So then it is more probable that there are less water molecules to the right and to the left. So therefore friction, so the number of interactions with water molecules, is lower. So if you would characterize this random motion by a constant, let's call it d for now, then there is the kinetic energy, so the moving energy, and there is some sort of friction term that gives you a movement rate, let's call it the rate of movement parameter. Okay. And later it's going to, it will turn out to be a diffusion coefficient, but we'll come to that in a moment. So proteins diffuse, they randomly move. So they have erratic, random walks. That is because they experience collisions amongst each other and with water molecules. And if you have more interactions with molecules because you're bigger, you have more interactions. So then you experience more friction. You experience more of these interactions, then you move slower. So the friction term increases for proteins that are large. Now, the other thing that is important, so this is now water. But if you would compare this to maple syrup, so in maple syrup the molecules have more interactions amongst each other, right? So if you have sticky watery solution, so it's a viscous solution, then of course you also have, you have more friction ultimately. Well, you don't have, okay, you do have more friction because the molecules that you bump into, they are tightly bound to each other. So it's very hard to open a path for yourself to actually make a net movement. Okay, so somehow the diffusion coefficient is going to depend on size and something like viscosity, right? So maple syrupness, and maybe some other constants. So it turns out that this diffusion coefficient is 6 times pi times the viscosity of the medium times the radius of the molecule. So this is the radius, this is the viscosity. And 6 times pi occurs because we're thinking about round molecules, globular molecules, spheres. So these have, these are just there because we're talking about, so these are spherical of nature. Because we're talking about spheres, this 6 pi turns out. Okay, so that means that the diffusion coefficient, so which is a measure for the rate of the spontaneous movement, decreases when you have bigger molecules and when the environment is more viscous. And it increases when you have higher temperature. So this increase, I guess, with infusion. This equation was derived by Einstein early on in his career, more than 100 years ago. Okay, and it's very useful. And its use will become clear next. So molecules, of course, can only interact if they collide. So molecules can only react if they collide. So conversions can only occur when molecules collide, and molecules can only be broken down by other molecules if they collide. So molecular interactions generally reactions require collisions. These collisions occur due to diffusive movement. Okay. And the rate with which that happens, so a measure for its rate is this diffusion coefficient. So let's do a silly experiment for just for the purpose of getting the message across. So let's say we pile molecules on top of each other in on some surface that is well, infinitely long. Okay. And well, all these molecules, they, so to make it explicit, consider a patty dish, alright, so like this, and we have water. We pile all the molecules on top of each other. And all these molecules at times they are going to move. And this is going to be random, right? So if this on average the same number of molecules moves to the right and to the left. And when time progresses, molecules will have moved more. But of course, if movement is random, then always on average you will have the same number of steps to the left as to the right. So it's very improbable that you have proteins or molecules that have only taken steps to the right. Okay. So sometime later we find molecules here and there and there and there, and in the middle we will always have the highest number of molecules. Whereas on the edges we have always lower molecules because they have had, so these molecules have had more steps to the right and these molecules have had more steps to the left. So that is actually more and more probable. It's the most probable thing is that you have an equal number of molecules to right and left. So they stay in the middle. A time later it has spread more and more, and until you have an even spread. Okay. So the randomness of diffusion is important. With that it means there is an equal probability to move to the left and to the right. So if you pile molecules on top of each other, then eventually they are evenly spread. But over time, in the beginning, it's more probable to find molecules in the middle because they've had an equal number of steps to the left and right, and molecules that have a net movement to the left or to the right, that net movement decreases in probability if it's further from the middle, until everything is evenly spread. And that is sort of happens when molecules can return from the edges to the middle. That is roughly the time when you have an equal spreading. Because then you can move left and right, and then you have an equal number of left and right steps, but you've hit the corners, right? And then you're evenly spread. So eventually there will be an even spread. Now, the rate with which these molecules move is determined by this equation, by their size, by the viscosity of the medium that they're in, and by the temperature. So, if I have now a cell and I have two molecules that can form complex, so this one is moving, and at some point they collide, then only after their collision a chemical reaction can take place, and let's say they both change shape. We need to collide first and then react. So collide first the collision, to react. And the collision is due to diffusion. So now reactions that are fast, reactions that are fast occur on a short time scale. So a fast reaction, let's say, is milliseconds or microseconds, as opposed to one that takes hours to complete, right? And so if we define the time, if we define the reaction rate of a reaction, if it's high, if the time for the reaction is short, then the time for the reaction, right, is the sum of the collision time plus, say, a chemical time that has to do with the conversion. So this is the time for the reaction. So first the molecules have to find each other and then chemistry occurs, and the sum of those two times is the reaction time. Now if these chemical processes are really fast, so you can neglect them with respect to the collision time, then the reaction time is approximately the collision time, right? So for fast chemical processes, the reaction time is approximately the collision time. To be precise, in case of fast intramolecular chemistry, reaction time is approximately the collision time. And the collision time clearly depends on the diffusion coefficient of both molecules, right? So if two molecules need to form a complex, but one is not moving, then the collision time is greater than in the case when both will be moving. So now this collision time, tau, it's going to depend on the volume of the cell, because if two molecules want to find each other in a large volume, it's going to take longer than if they find each other in a small volume. It's going to depend on their diffusion coefficients, or the diffusion coefficient of molecule A and of molecule B, if we consider the formation of the complex AB. It's going to depend on their radii, because if they're both bigger, they bump into each other quicker. And it has to do again with we assume all these things to be spherical, so that's where the 4-pi comes from in this case. So this is the equation that tells you, that gives you the collision time for two molecules AB, given their diffusion coefficients, approximated by this equation, and given their radii. And it depends, this collision time, on the surface volume. If it's larger, it takes longer. If these guys are bigger, it takes shorter. If these guys move slower, then they also find each other at a later time, so the collision time is larger. Okay, so the reaction time, right, can be approximated by some constant perhaps, divided by this collision time. So if the collision time is short, the reaction, it's called a rate, the reaction rate is high. Okay? And when you have fast intramolecular chemistry, so that's the stuff that happens as soon as molecules have collided, then the reaction time can be approximated by this collision time, and this is the equation for the collision time. So fundamental to all biochemical processes inside cells is diffusion. And diffusion typically, I think, agrees with intuition, with size, viscosity, and temperature, and then rate of movement and size and the surface volume. Okay, let's stop here.